And I was like, what on earth is going on? Because my Spanish was really strong, but now like my Portuguese is just completely messing with it, and it was completely disorientating. Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to the Story Learning podcast. I hope you're having a great week. And today's question is all about this, like probably the most asked about topic in the history, the more than 10-year history of this podcast, and it's all about learning two languages without breaking your brain. I think so many of us who get into language learning, like we just want to learn tons of languages, right? And so we often find ourselves in the position of studying two languages at once. And then we realize, hang on, this is creating a few problems, because what happens is we get a bit muddled up, don't we? And we can make progress in one and lose the other, and then make progress in the other and lose, you know how it goes. So today's question comes from Lisa, and Lisa asks, I have a question about learning two Romance languages. I've been learning French for about 10 years. Good job. I started on Duolingo, but your books catapulted me out of the beginner space into intermediate and conversational fluency. After about 5 years of basic French, I added Italian into the mix. I can read in both, and I'm using AI for speaking, but the effort of suppression is making speaking difficult. Any tips for real-time language suppression in French when speaking Italian? Well, Lisa, thank you very much for your question, and very, very common. I think everyone who has tried learning two languages has experienced something similar. And you probably know my position on this because I've talked about it so many times, which is that, like, just generally speaking, you want to avoid learning two languages at the same time, because the depth of focus is so key with language learning, right? So it's much better to learn one language first to a high level, and then once you're really solid in one language, which we would normally consider to be like a B2 or upper intermediate level, then you can start learning another language, and you can have a much better time of it because you can focus on the new language and you're not going to forget your old language, right? But your question is, how do you stop it interfering? Now, this is really interesting. So you have learned French, Lisa. I'm going to guess you're at a pretty good level because you've been learning for 10 years. And you're learning French and Italian, which are two very, very similar languages. And I remember learning French, and then, in my case, it was French and then Spanish. I mean, it's really hard, right? I'll be speaking Spanish and then a French word will come out like almost without thinking about it. And it's really frustrating because you want to, you're learning the new language and you know the word, but the French keeps coming out. So, well, why does this happen? So I was looking at some of the research, and it's absolutely fascinating here. So this is from the Journal of Memory and Language, volume 128, 2023. And it's from a paper called Interference Between Non-Native Languages During Trilingual Language Production. So basically, when you're speaking three languages, like what gets in the way of what? And they studied trilinguals, right? So they studied people who spoke Spanish, Basque, and English, French, and Spanish. And they did this fascinating speed naming task to assess interference across languages, right? So they asked them to name simple words in different languages quickly to see what would happen. And what they found was that when you're speaking another language, you get a lot more interference from your other foreign language than you do from your native language. So let's say that, in this case, Lisa, you're learning French and Italian, and you're starting to learn Italian. You're going to have a lot more problems in your Italian coming from your French than from your English, right? So it's the L3 that's interfering with the L2, or the L2 that's interfering with the L3. This paper also showed that trilinguals inhibited their L1 more strongly than their L3, meaning that it's a lot easier for you, if you're speaking Italian, Lisa, it's a lot easier for you to suppress your English and not use English. Like, it's a lot easier for you to do that. You can keep your English out of your Italian, but you can't keep your French out of your Italian, right? And this has been proven by research, which is also my experience. So like the time that I noticed this most acutely was when I had learned, by this point I'd learned French and Spanish and Portuguese. My Spanish I got to a very good level because I spent a lot of time in Spain. My best friend was from Spain, and my Spanish was really good. Then I learned Portuguese, and I spent like the best part of a year in Brazil. And so my Portuguese got very good, and Portuguese is very similar to Spanish. Now, I remember coming back from Brazil to London, where I had a lot of friends from all over the place. And I would go and I would see my Spanish-speaking friends, and I would be speaking to them in Spanish, and it was a complete disaster because I was like speaking Spanish, but Portuguese with Portuguese grammar, and I couldn't get the Portuguese grammar out of my head. And I was like, what on earth is going on? Because my Spanish was really strong, but now like my Portuguese is just completely messing with it. And it was completely disorientating. Now, luckily, because of the environment that I was in, I was able to spend a lot of time in environments where I had friends from South America, Spain, and Brazil, meaning that Spanish and Portuguese were being used all the time. And so what that enabled me to do was to be constantly using both Spanish and Portuguese at the same time in the same evening with the same people. And so I was able to train myself to separate the languages. Now, when I think about like how I did that, it was, I think, a combination of there was a lot of conscious effort involved at first, but eventually, I'll tell you what it was. By using both at the same time, it was almost like learning another language, actually. It was almost like learning a fourth language, and that fourth language was the ability to keep these languages separate in my mind. And over the weeks and the months, I developed the ability to do this. And I'll tell you what was at the root of it. Like when I managed to do it eventually, like I got to a point eventually where I could swap from Spanish to Portuguese, and I was like almost without error, without interference at all. And it was 100% an identity question that allowed me to do it. So in my mind, I would be, okay, I'm Brazilian now, and then I'm Spanish now, and I'm Brazilian now, and Spanish. And almost like from one sentence to the next, like Brazilian person speaks to me, like a Portuguese switch, like a Brazilian identity switch flicks in my brain, and like I'm speaking to you in Portuguese. Now someone else is speaking to me in Spanish from that corner. Again, flick the switch, I'm in Spanish now, and I was able to associate the language with that identity, and that was enough to kind of bucket that language for me. Now I can't fully explain how or why that works, but I just know that it can, and I think that this is kind of where a goal that you can end up with languages when you get to a level of like very, very high competence, which is that your identity becomes that language and that culture, and the words in your brain become associated with that. Now, I'm not like natively bilingual. Okay, I grew up speaking English till I was 19 years old. I wonder if for bilingual people that's the same thing, because like all the bilingual people that I know who are bilingual from birth, I don't notice any interference from them. They have the languages, it's my impression that they have the languages very, very clearly separated in their mind. Like they're never going to be speaking like Spanish and then Italian comes out. It just doesn't happen because they're so competent at it. And I think the identity, I suspect that they feel such a strong identity between the language and that part of their life or their experience, like whether their mother was French and their father was Spanish. That identity piece is so strong that they're able to kind of slot the language neatly into that identity, and you don't get that much bleeding between the two. I really suspect that's how it works, and so that's been my experience, so I do think that, Lisa, what I would be recommending to you is to carry on with your Italian, but see if you can find this identity in your mind, the Italian identity that is separate from the French identity. Try to hold that in your cognition to some extent, and see if that helps you eventually be able to keep these separate. But I do think that it's important to actually, now that you're learning Italian, to focus on that. I would probably put your French aside for a while now and just focus entirely on Italian, because in order to do what I've described here with this identity thing, you do need to have both languages to a very strong level, right? You got to have both languages really good, and to be able to, like, in order to be able to switch them in that way. Now, learning two languages that are similar gives you advantages, of course, right? So if you are learning French and Italian, you've got a lot of transfer there that can help you. So there's a lot of vocabulary in French that very similar in Italian, so that can help you a massive amount. Obviously, grammar as well is very similar, so there's a lot that can help you there as well. You have very limited help if you were learning, say, Japanese and French. There's almost nothing in common between these two languages. So there's a lot there, although you're experiencing some interference, there's also a lot there that can help you, which is also worth remembering, because it's not all bad news. But generally, in order to keep that separation in your mind, I do generally recommend that if you're going to learn a second language, it's better that your third language be very different from the second, So an example might be, learning French and then going on to learn Japanese, for example. You'll have a lot less interference from French to Japanese than you would from French to Italian. But of course, we never want to just learn a language just for the sake of it being different, right? We always learn languages because they are useful and interesting for us. And that is the way I think that one should go about learning languages. It needs to be meaningful for you, or there really is no point. So, Lisa, I think you're onto a great path, and you're clearly doing really well. My recommendation would be focus on the Italian, get it as good as you can, and then try to create this Italian identity in your brain, and then preserve that French identity, and it will come good in the end. And this question of the difficulty of languages and how close is one language to the next is really important. It's also very, very interesting, and we've created a language difficulty guide at StoryLearning, which is a little bit like, you've probably seen these charts online which show how relatively difficult different languages are. But the one that we've made at StoryLearning adds an extra layer onto that, because it groups different languages by similarity. So it will show you, if you are learning Turkish, what languages are there that, maybe difficult languages, but have so much similarity to Turkish that actually makes it easier to learn. Right, so we kind of added, it's a multi-dimensional chart, and you can get a free copy of the language difficulty guide by clicking the link in the description. If nothing else, it's very interesting just to kind of look through and see similarities between languages that you might not otherwise have spotted. Anyway, that is all for today. If you'd like to ask me a question for the podcast, you can do so in the comments of the podcast on the YouTube channel. We look everywhere for these. We also regularly check reviews, so if you'd like to leave us a review for the podcast, that actually really helps, because it helps the algorithm, helps other people discover the podcast. So you could always leave a nice review for me of the podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and include your question in the review as well. We will check that. Anyway, that's all from me today, and I'll see you back in the next episode of the podcast.